If you can dance the tango, I'll marry you." The words sliced through the golden air of the ballroom, heavy with champagne laughter and the shimmer of chandeliers. Every guest froze for a moment, then laughter erupted like cruel applause. The man who said it, Alexander Voss, stood tall, his tuxedo gleaming, a smirk carved on his flawless face. Across from him, a young waitress in red and white clutched her tray, her lips trembling but silent. The room feasted on humiliation. Men chuckled behind their glasses, women whispered, eyes glimmering with gossip. The orchestra paused mid-note, as if even the violins hesitated to take sides. The waitress, Clara, did not bow, did not cry. She only stared at him with a calm that cut deeper than words. Alexander raised an eyebrow, amused by her silence. "Come now," he said, voice echoing through marble and glass. "Isn't that what you people dream of? A little attention." His laughter was sharp, like the crack of breaking ice. But in that stillness, he didn't notice her fingers tightening around the silver tray. The light caught her face, half shadow, half gold. Her eyes, dark and steady, held something fierce, something dangerous. For a heartbeat he faltered, uncertain why her silence unnerved him. But the crowd's laughter pulled him back, feeding his pride. He turned away, raising his glass as if to toast his own cruelty. Clara took one slow breath, steadying herself. The weight of humiliation burned through her chest, but behind it, something older stirred, something buried beneath years of quiet work and forgotten music. The echo of tango steps returned like a ghost, not in her ears, but in her pulse. Someone whispered, "She's blushing," and laughter followed again. The ballroom sparkled, merciless and magnificent, as if mocking her pain with beauty. But Clara did not flee. She stood still, rooted like a dancer before the first note, her tray trembling only slightly, every second stretched like an eternity of shame. A waiter beside her muttered, "Just ignore him, Clara." But she didn't move. Her silence became heavier than all the noise in that room. She looked once more at Alexander, long enough for him to notice, and something in his chest tightened, though he didn't understand why. The orchestra resumed softly, as if ashamed. Yet the melody that returned was not the waltz they had played before. It was slower, deeper, almost a tango. For a moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Clara's heart beat once, twice, in rhythm with the forgotten dance she once loved. Alexander turned back, sensing the sudden stillness. Their eyes met again. Her gaze no longer trembled. It burned, steady and unforgiving. For the first time that night he had no words to follow his arrogance. The laughter around him began to fade, leaving only silence and the faint hum of strings. Clara finally lowered her tray. She whispered something only she could hear, a promise, not a plea. Then she turned away, walking with quiet grace toward the exit. Every step deliberate, every breath like the opening of a dance she hadn't yet begun. Behind her, Alexander stood frozen, unsure why victory suddenly felt like defeat. And as the doors closed behind her, the golden ballroom fell silent. The laughter had died, but its echo lingered, wrapped in shame, pride, and the memory of eyes that refused to break. That night, no one knew that humiliation had just awakened a dancer the world had forgotten. The music ended hours ago, but the echoes still lived in the walls. The ballroom was empty now, a graveyard of champagne flutes and forgotten napkins. Clara moved through it slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick silence. The golden light that once dazzled now felt pale, almost cruel. The air smelled of roses and shame. She set down her tray on a deserted table and stared at the floor where she had stood before him. The marble still held the ghost of her reflection, small, trembling, defiant. She replayed the scene in her mind. His smirk, The laughter, the sting. Each sound returned sharper than before, slicing through her composure. The humiliation burned fresh again, like an open wound refusing to close. For a moment she wanted to scream, to throw every glass to the ground, to let the noise drown her pain. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her uniform, pressed her trembling hands together, and breathed. Her mother always told her, "Dignity is the last dance no one can steal." So Clara stood tall, even in the ruins of her pride. Outside, rain began to fall against the tall windows, blurring the golden city lights beyond. She watched them melt into silver streaks, like tears she refused to shed. The night was too beautiful for her sorrow, and that made it worse. Beauty had turned against her, just as laughter had. A cleaner passed behind her, muttering about overtime and broken glasses. He didn't notice her stillness, or maybe he pretended not to. Some wounds were too visible to meet with eyes. Clara's silence filled the room like perfume, soft, sad, impossible to ignore. She walked to the edge of the dance floor. The polished marble reflected her face, pale and tired. She remembered the sound of tango heels, the smell of old theatres, the applause that once wrapped around her like light. How far she had fallen, from dancer to servant, from spotlight to shadow. The thought pressed hard against her chest. When she closed her eyes, music returned, not from the ballroom, but from memory. The first chords of Por una cabeza, her mother's favorite tango. Her hands rose slightly, almost against her will, tracing the air as if holding an invisible partner. Her body remembered steps her mind had buried. For a brief second, she danced with the ghost of who she used to be. Then, the lights flickered, and the moment vanished. The floor beneath her felt colder, heavier. Reality returned like a slap. Bills to pay, a mother to care for, a world that never looked twice at a waitress. She gathered her tray and forced herself toward the exit, her reflection fading from the marble one last time. Outside, the city waited, wet pavements, flickering lights, and the soft hum of midnight cars. She stood beneath the awning, letting the rain kiss her face. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in her mind, but it no longer cut. It haunted instead, softer, almost like rhythm. Somewhere inside her, something small but unbroken began to stir. Clara turned once toward the ballroom, its golden glow fading behind her. "One day," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain, "you'll hear me dance." Then she walked into the rain, her shoes tapping faintly against the pavement, an echo, a promise, a rhythm waiting to return. Before the shame, before the golden laughter, there had been music. Real music, the kind that filled small theaters and lit the world from the inside out. Clara Mendez had once been a name whispered with admiration among dancers in Buenos Aires. Her movements were silk and fire, her smile born of rhythm itself, and yet, like a candle in the wind, her dream faded before anyone noticed it was gone. Her mother's illness came like a slow storm, quiet at first, then relentless. Hospital corridors replaced rehearsal halls, and the smell of antiseptic took the place of roses. The trophies that once gleamed now gathered dust beside her mother's medicine bottles. Still, Clara practiced one step each morning in the kitchen, barefoot, to keep her soul from stiffening. Her mother would smile, even when pain silenced her voice. Those small dances were their secret language, a promise that life could still be beautiful. Clara never cried in front of her. She saved her tears for the nights when the city slept. Through the thin apartment walls, the faint hum of tango music played from an old radio. It was their companion, their heartbeat, their hope. She believed that one day, when her mother was well again, they would return to the stage together. But healing never came. Bills grew heavier, dreams lighter. The world outside kept spinning while hers stood still. She worked at cafes, cleaned offices, served dinners for strangers who never saw her face. Each night she returned home with sore feet and a smile she wore like armor, until even smiling became a kind of lie. One winter evening her mother took her hand and whispered, "Promise me, mi niña, never stop dancing, even if it's only in your heart." Those words clung to Clara like perfume that never faded. But when the coughing worsened and the nights grew long, the music inside her began to falter. She stopped dancing altogether, as if movement itself had betrayed her. After the funeral, the apartment fell silent. The radio was still on the table, its antenna bent, a faint hiss of static where music once lived. Clara sat beside her mother's shoes, the red ones she wore to every performance, now dulled with dust. Grief had its own rhythm, slow, cruel, and endless. It taught her to breathe without sound. Days turned into months. Life became a repetition of necessity. Eat, work, sleep, repeat. But every now and then, a stranger's laughter or the distant sound of violins would stop her in her tracks. For a heartbeat, the old Clara, the dancer, would rise again within her, and then the world would remind her of who she'd become. One morning, she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The spark was gone, replaced by something hollow yet waiting, like a stage before the lights come up. She touched her reflection gently, whispering, "Maybe someday." It was the smallest prayer, but it kept her alive. That same week, a letter arrived from a friend she hadn't seen in years. A catering company needed staff for a high society charity event. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. Clara folded the letter slowly, her eyes falling on her mother's photograph. "Just one night," she murmured. "Then I'll rest." But somewhere deep inside, she knew fate was already calling her back to the ballroom. She opened the drawer where her old dance shoes rested. Her fingers lingered on the worn leather, tracing the marks of every step she once mastered. Then she closed it again, hiding the past from herself. Outside, the city glowed, unaware that destiny had just taken its first quiet breath. If this part of Clara's story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Tell me which moment you felt the most. The night was colder than usual, the kind that made the city lights shimmer like frost. Clara fastened the black apron around her waist and studied her reflection in the catering van's window. The uniform was clean but faceless, designed to make her invisible. She didn't mind. Invisibility had become her safest mask. What she didn't know was that fate was quietly stitching the seams of a cruel reunion. Inside the grand hotel, the air smelled of money and anticipation. Waiters lined up like soldiers, balancing trays of champagne beneath crystal chandeliers. The event, the Voss Foundation Gala for the Arts, promised elegance, music, and guests worth millions. Clara adjusted her collar, unaware that the name printed on the invitation she carried belonged to the man who once shattered her pride. When she stepped into the ballroom, it felt like walking into memory. The same gold, the same music, the same soft cruelty that had scarred her heart years ago. She hesitated near the entrance, her breath catching. Every sparkle of light seemed to mock her, whispering fragments of laughter from a night she'd spent years trying to forget. Her co-worker nudged her. "You all right? You look pale." Clara nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." But her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she picked up the silver tray. The scent of roses hit her again, and with it came the weight of humiliation that never truly left. She steadied herself, pressing her fingers against the cold glass. Across the hall, Alexander Voss arrived to applause. Tall, immaculate, surrounded by cameras, he looked untouchable. Time had been kind to him, too kind. His charm filled the room like perfume, disarming, practiced, perfect. But Clara saw the man behind the perfection, the arrogance that once made the world his stage. He didn't see her at first. To him, she was just another face among the staff, a blur in motion, nameless, ordinary. But when his eyes finally met hers across the hall, something shifted. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The glass in his hand tilted slightly, and the applause around him seemed to fade. Recognition came slowly, like a chill creeping up his spine. Clara lowered her gaze, pretending not to notice. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sharp collision of past and present. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say, how she would stand. Yet now, words felt useless. She simply breathed, steady and silent, letting her composure become her armor. Alexander followed her with his eyes, confusion masked by curiosity. Something about her presence disturbed the perfect order of his evening. She carried herself with the grace of someone who didn't belong among waiters. There was rhythm in her stillness, a faint echo of something he couldn't name. The memory of a voice, a challenge, a promise long forgotten. The orchestra began to play softly, the opening notes of a tango. It was coincidence, perhaps, or fate with a cruel sense of timing. The melody brushed against Clara's soul like an old wound reopening. Her fingers trembled again, and the tray tilted, one glass nearly slipping. But she caught it, just before it shattered. The near fall drew his gaze once more. Alexander raised his glass in her direction, an amused smirk forming. He didn't remember why she felt familiar, only that her silence irritated him. For him, it was another evening of control, another nameless life beneath his attention. For her, it was the return of everything she'd tried to bury. And as the music swelled, their eyes met one last time. The man of power and the woman he had broken. Neither spoke. But beneath the gold and glitter, something unseen began to stir, slow as fate and twice as certain. Alexander Voss prided himself on reading people, investors, partners, politicians, but that night he couldn't read her. The woman who moved among the guests with silent grace felt both familiar and foreign. Something about her presence scratched at his memory like an unsolved riddle. It bothered him, though he would never admit why. Pride doesn't tolerate confusion. Clara served each table with the precision of someone holding herself together by threads. Her mind drifted between the rhythm of footsteps and the pulse in her chest. When she reached his table, her hand brushed the rim of his glass. A tremor passed through her, a flash of memory, the echo of laughter under chandeliers. She froze, but only for a heartbeat. Then she smiled, the smallest, saddest smile imaginable. Alexander looked up. Their eyes met, for the second time in years, and silence bloomed between them. The noise of the gala faded to a dull murmur. Her name hovered at the edge of his thoughts, but he couldn't catch it. Only her gaze remained calm, yet unyielding, as if she carried a truth he had long forgotten. "Do I know you?" he asked, his tone light, careless, masking curiosity with arrogance. Clara lowered her eyes, shaking her head softly. "No, sir," she said, voice steady, but her throat burned. The words cost her more than he could imagine. He smirked, dismissing the unease as pride. But somewhere deep inside, a splinter of doubt began to form. As she walked away, he kept watching her, something tightening in his chest. Her movement wasn't just work, it was art disguised as labor. He didn't understand why it unsettled him. Maybe it was the contradiction, humility wrapped in poise, silence that demanded attention. For a man used to control, that kind of stillness felt like defiance. Later that night, Alexander lingered near the bar, pretending to listen to a conversation he had no interest in. His eyes searched the crowd until he found her again, clearing tables near the edge of the hall. She moved without looking up, focused, distant. The sight stirred a strange irritation in him, the kind born from recognition one refuses to face. He turned to his assistant, forcing a smirk. "Funny, isn't it? Some people spend their whole lives serving others when they were born to entertain." The remark drew polite laughter, but even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. He wasn't mocking her anymore. He was trying to silence something in himself. When Clara heard his voice, the tray in her hands felt heavier. Each syllable carried the same arrogance she remembered, the tone that once cut through her dignity. But this time, it didn't make her flinch. It only deepened the quiet flame within her. She kept working, her silence louder than his insult. Sometimes restraint is the most powerful rebellion. As the gala drew to an end, she stepped outside to breathe. The cool night air kissed her cheeks, calming the heat in her chest. Behind her, music and laughter spilled into the street, chasing her like ghosts. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You don't remember me. But one day, you will." The words drifted into the night like smoke, invisible but real. Inside, Alexander watched her leave through the tall glass doors. The crowd still praised him, cameras still flashed, but something in him lingered on her shadow. He didn't understand why the sight of a simple waitress made the evening feel strangely unfinished. Pride told him to forget. Yet pride, that night, was already beginning to crack. By morning, the story had spread through Alexander's circle like perfume and poison. Someone had whispered that the billionaire seemed strangely distracted by a waitress at his own gala. Another added, with a smirk, that she might have rejected his attention. Pride does not tolerate rumor, and Alexander's pride was the kind that burned cold. He laughed it off in public, but the echo of her eyes stayed with him long after the champagne was gone. He stood by his penthouse window, watching the city shimmer beneath the early light. Everything below him belonged to him. Companies, properties, influence, everything except peace. The more he tried to erase the image of her calm defiance, the sharper it grew. He poured himself another drink, though the night had long ended. Some ghosts arrive not to haunt, but to humiliate. Clara, meanwhile, returned home, exhausted but unbroken. She could still hear the laughter from the gala, soft, distant, fading into memory. But she also remembered the way he had looked at her, not with cruelty this time, but confusion. That brief crack in his confidence was enough to make her heart steady. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt awake. A few days later, her manager called her into the catering office. The man avoided her gaze, shuffling papers nervously. "I'm sorry, Clara," he muttered, "but your services won't be needed anymore." The words struck with quiet precision. No explanation followed, though she didn't need one. Power has its own language, and Alexander had spoken it without saying a word. She gathered her apron and coat, her dignity intact. Others might have begged, argued or cried, but not Clara. The silence she carried had already endured worse. Outside, the city roared as if mocking her calm. She stood on the sidewalk, watching people rush past, and whispered, "He still hasn't learned." Then she walked away, each step deliberate, her posture defying defeat. At his office later that afternoon, Alexander signed contracts and ignored questions. The world saw efficiency. His assistant saw tension. The pen in his hand shook slightly, though his voice remained smooth. "That waitress," he said suddenly, eyes fixed on nothing. "What was her name?" The assistant hesitated. "Clara Mendez, sir." The name landed like a forgotten melody. He repeated it quietly, letting it roll off his tongue. Clara. Something about it stirred discomfort. Not attraction, but recognition. Yet pride, sharp as glass, sliced through his thoughts. "Have the agency remove her from their roster," he said flatly. "No distractions." The assistant nodded, unaware that the order carried more emotion than logic. Alexander returned to his papers, pretending he still ruled everything, even memory. That night, Clara walked the old streets of her neighborhood, the ones lined with bakeries and dim lights. Children laughed in the distance. A man played guitar by a window. The sound reminded her of simpler days, before ambition, before pride, before pain wore a suit. She closed her eyes and listened. The music didn't heal her, but it steadied her. Every note whispered, "You still have something he doesn't." At home, she sat by the small table where her mother's photograph rested. The flicker of a candle painted warmth across the cold walls. "He tried to erase me," she said softly, "but he only reminded me who I am." She opened the drawer where her dance shoes lay hidden and touched them gently. The leather was cracked, the heels worn, like her, imperfect but alive. Far above the city, Alexander poured another glass and stared at his reflection in the window. The empire stretched below him, glittering, obedient, meaningless. He told himself he had won, that the unease she stirred was gone. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw her again, silent, graceful, unbroken. And for the first time in years, he wondered if wealth could ever outweigh the weight of his own pride. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came down in waves, washing the city in grey. Clara sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the water trace trembling paths down the glass. The envelope lay unopened on the table beside her, the one from the hospital. She already knew what it said. Hope had been thinning for weeks, and now it was gone. Her mother's absence hollowed the air like silence after music. The bed still carried her shape, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the sheets. Clara couldn't bring herself to fold them, as if doing so would erase her mother's last presence. The room was still, too still, the kind of quiet that hums with memory. She sat there for hours, waiting for a sound that would never come. At the funeral, only a handful of neighbors came. The priest spoke gently, but his words floated past her like smoke. Clara's hands stayed locked around the single rose she carried. She didn't cry. The tears had dried days ago, replaced by a numbness that felt safer. When the coffin lowered into the earth, she whispered, "I'll dance again, Mama, for both of us." Back home, she lit a candle by the photograph on the table, her mother smiling, young, radiant. The flame flickered, fragile yet stubborn, and its warmth spread through the cold air. Clara took her mother's rosary, winding it between her fingers as if it could still connect them. Outside, thunder echoed faintly, but inside, the silence was heavier. Grief had no rhythm, no pattern, only weight. Days blurred into one another. She worked small jobs when she could, cleaning offices, folding linens, scrubbing what others ignored. Her hands cracked from soap and water, her body ached, but her mind stayed elsewhere. Every face she served reminded her of his. Every laugh in a grand hall echoed the cruelty she'd endured. Life seemed determined to replay her humiliation. One evening, as she emptied the trash behind a cafe, the rain returned. Soft at first, then relentless. She leaned against the brick wall, closing her eyes. The water soaked her hair, her clothes, her grief. But as it did, something inside her broke open. She began to move, just a single step, then another, the faint rhythm of a tango in her head. The rain became her music, the street her stage. She danced barefoot in the puddles, her body trembling, her breath uneven. It wasn't graceful, not yet. It was raw, desperate, alive. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt something other than sorrow. The dance wasn't a performance, it was survival. Her tears mingled with the rain, and for a brief moment the world didn't hurt. It simply existed. When the storm passed, she returned home soaked and shivering, but lighter. She stood before the mirror, hair clinging to her face, eyes burning with exhaustion and something fierce. "You're still here?" she whispered to her reflection. It wasn't pride, it was proof. Proof that no humiliation, No loss, no cruelty could fully silence the rhythm inside her. That night, she opened an old wooden box beneath her bed. Inside lay her mother's brooch, a train ticket from years ago, and a photograph of a dance studio in Buenos Aires. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding with memory and longing. "Maybe it's time," she murmured. The thought scared her, and yet, for the first time, it felt like hope. In the quiet hours before dawn, Clara packed a small bag. She left the candle burning beside her mother's photograph, the flame steady and tall. As the first light touched the sky, she whispered a promise into the emptiness. "I'll find the music again." And when she closed the door behind her, it wasn't an ending. It was the first step of her return. Buenos Aires welcomed her with the scent of old rain and the sound of music drifting from every corner. It was the city she had once called a dream, and now it felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The taxis sped by in streaks of light, and the air hummed with life she no longer recognized. Clara stood outside the small dance studio her mentor once owned, clutching her suitcase. The sign above the door was faded, but her heart knew every letter. Inside, the wooden floor creaked as if remembering her footsteps. Dust floated in the air, catching the light like lost time. Posters of old performances lined the walls, some yellowed and torn. She saw her own face in one, younger, fearless, alive, and had to look away. The memories came like waves, too fast, too loud. For the first time she wondered if she had been foolish to return. Her old mentor, Señor Ramirez, appeared from the back room, his grey hair wild, his eyes still sharp. "Clara," he said softly, disbelief wrapped in warmth. "The prodigal dancer returns." She smiled faintly and bowed her head. "If you'll still have me." He looked her over, the tired eyes, the calloused hands, and nodded. The floor never forgets those who loved it. Training began the next morning. The first step was agony. Her muscles screamed in protest, her balance betrayed her, and the mirror showed every flaw she had tried to bury. Each time she stumbled, a ghost of laughter echoed in her mind. His laughter, the ballroom, the challenge. She clenched her fists and kept going. Pride had once wounded her, now it kept her standing. By the third day, the ache in her body became constant, almost comforting. Pain meant progress. Sweat covered her skin like armor, and every fall left her angrier, stronger. But beneath that determination lay doubt, deep, sharp, unspoken. She was older now, slower, quieter. The fire that once drew applause flickered uncertainly. What if her time had truly passed? Late one evening, when the studio emptied and the city slept, she stayed behind. The moonlight spilled through the windows, silvering the floor. She stood alone in the center, barefoot, the world reduced to the echo of her own breathing. Slowly, she raised her arms, took position, and waited for courage. It came, but so did fear. The music began softly from the old speaker, a haunting tango she hadn't heard in years. Por una cabeza. The same melody from the night of her humiliation. Her throat tightened, and tears filled her eyes before the first step. Yet she moved. The rhythm carried her body even as her soul trembled. Every motion became a dialogue between who she was and who she might still be. Halfway through she stumbled, hard. Pain shot through her ankle, sending her to her knees. The song continued mercilessly, and she pressed her palms to the floor, gasping. "I can't," she whispered. The word echoed off the empty walls, cruel and familiar. For a long time she stayed there, listening to the music fade into silence. Doubt had found her, and this time it didn't leave. When Ramirez returned later, he found her sitting by the mirror, eyes red but dry. He said nothing, simply placed a hand on her shoulder. "Even stars forget how to shine," he murmured. "But the sky never forgets where they belong." She nodded, unable to speak. His words planted something fragile, not strength, but the memory of it. That night, Clara walked home under the dim streetlights, her reflection rippling in puddles. She felt smaller than the city, smaller than her grief, but not invisible. As she passed a cafe, music spilled into the street again, laughter, guitar, rhythm. She stopped to listen, closing her eyes. The pain in her ankle pulsed with the beat. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not done yet." Weeks passed, each day blurring into the next. The pain in Clara's ankle faded, replaced by a quiet rhythm of persistence. The mornings were harsh, cold showers, aching muscles, hours of repetition under the mirror's unflinching gaze. But beneath the fatigue, something delicate began to grow again, confidence. It came in fragments, a turn done right, a movement remembered, a heartbeat aligned with the music. Ramirez watched her silently from the corner of the studio, his expression unreadable. "You dance differently now," he finally said one afternoon. "Before, you danced to be seen. Now, you dance to survive." Clara smiled faintly, her breath still heavy. "Maybe that's what I had to learn." He nodded, his eyes soft with pride. "Pain makes better rhythm than applause." One night, after the others had gone, she stayed behind, lost in the music. The lights were dim, and only the sound of her shoes against the floor filled the room. Her movements were no longer perfect. They were true. When she finished, she looked up to find Ramirez recording from the doorway, smiling. "The world forgot you once," he said. "Let it see what it missed." A few days later, he posted the video online, naming it The Return of Clara Mendez. Neither of them expected anything. But by morning, thousands had watched. By nightfall, it had reached millions. The comments poured in. "Who is she? That emotion! She dances like she's lived 1,000 lives." Clara read them in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. The world had found her again, and this time it wasn't through pity, it was through awe. In an office far away, Alexander Voss scrolled through his feed between meetings. A video autoplayed. A woman dancing alone in a dim studio, her body bending like fire and silk. He almost scrolled past it until the camera caught her face. His hand froze mid-air. The glass of water beside him trembled slightly. It couldn't be her. And yet, it was. He turned up the volume. The music filled his office, haunting and familiar. Each movement cut through the walls he'd built around himself. The control he prided himself on began to crumble as he watched. This was no waitress, no humiliation, no past. This was a woman reborn. When the dance ended, he realized his heart was pounding and his hand had clenched into a fist. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of her, strong, luminous, untouchable, replayed in his mind. For the first time, he didn't see defiance in her silence. He saw freedom. He rose from his bed, pacing the room as the city glittered below. Every decision, every cruelty, every careless word returned to him like a mirror he could no longer avoid. Meanwhile, Clara walked home beneath a sky full of stars. The air was cool, alive with possibility. Strangers had seen her dance, not the world of chandeliers and gowns, but people who felt her story in their bones. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She was seen, truly seen, by those who understood pain and beauty intertwined. Ramirez waited for her at the studio the next morning, holding a newspaper with her photo on the front page. "Fame again," he said, half proud, half cautious. "Be careful with it this time." She laughed softly, the sound carrying a warmth he hadn't heard in years. "This time," she said, "I dance for no one but her." She pointed to the sky, to her mother, to memory, to grace. And somewhere, miles away, Alexander watched the video again, this time in silence. His reflection glimmered in the dark glass of his office window. For the first time in years, he didn't see power or success looking back, only emptiness. He whispered her name once, barely audible. Clara. It was not guilt. It was awakening. The gala was held in the same ballroom where the laughter once broke her heart. Years had passed, but the gold still gleamed cruelly against the marble. The chandeliers shimmered as if mocking memory itself. Clara stood behind the curtain, the hum of the orchestra pulsing through the floor beneath her heels. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. Tonight was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming the silence that once defeated her. Ramirez's voice came softly from behind her. "Are you ready, mija?" She nodded, though her pulse betrayed her calm. "You'll see faces that remind you of pain," he warned gently. "But remember, pain cannot touch a soul that forgives." Clara smiled faintly, her reflection glowing beneath the light. "I'm not here to remember," she whispered. "I'm here to dance." When the curtain rose, the crowd gasped. The name Clara Mendez had filled headlines, but few expected her grace to be so human, so raw. She moved across the floor like wind made flesh, her dress flowing like red fire through the golden air. The applause rose, cautious at first, then thunderous. For a moment, every sound blurred, all except one, the rhythm of her own heart. At the back of the hall, Alexander Voss watched. He hadn't planned to attend, but curiosity had dragged him there like a chain. The first note struck him like confession. The music, that same tango, the same night, the same melody. He stood frozen, eyes locked on the woman he once humiliated. But this was no waitress. This was power reborn in grace. As she turned in perfect time, her gaze swept across the room and found him. The contact was fleeting, electric. She didn't falter, but her breath hitched. He too felt it, the collision of past and present, guilt and awe. The crowd vanished in that instant. Only two souls remained, suspended in rhythm and memory. When the music ended, the applause shook the chandeliers. Clara bowed, composed, serene, but inside her chest trembled with emotion too complex to name. She stepped off the stage into the soft hum of voices and clinking glasses. She had done it. She had danced in the same room where she had once been broken, and walked away whole. Alexander moved through the crowd, the weight of years pressing on every step. He wanted to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. She stood near the entrance, surrounded by admirers, her laughter light but distant. For the first time, he realized how small his world had been, how little his power meant when faced with the kind of strength that could endure silence. He approached slowly, unsure whether to expect anger or indifference. When she turned and saw him, the noise around them faded. "Mr. Voss," she greeted, calm as glass. He removed his hat, his confidence nowhere to be found. "You were extraordinary," he said softly. Her eyes studied him for a long moment. "I always was," she replied without pride, without bitterness, only truth. For a second, time stilled between them. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but none of it would undo what he had done. "Would you," he began, his voice trembling, "would you dance with me?" The question hung in the air, fragile, absurd, sincere. Clara's lips parted in surprise. Her instinct was to refuse, but something in his tone stopped her. She glanced at the dance floor once more, empty now, waiting, patient. The same space that had once humiliated her was offering a strange kind of peace. Slowly, she nodded. "One dance," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "No promises." And as they stepped into the golden light together, destiny, silent for so long, began to hum its melody once more. The music began slowly, its rhythm fragile as breath. The room fell into hush as they stepped onto the floor. Alexander's hand hovered near Clara's waist before settling gently, unsure, almost trembling. She felt the hesitation but said nothing. The orchestra swelled, strings rising like old ghosts remembering their cue. And just like that, the world began to fade around them. For a moment, they moved in unison, her grace guiding his stiffness, her certainty balancing his doubt. His hand was colder than she remembered, and his steps heavier, but his eyes, when they met hers, were no longer arrogant. They were searching. The crowd watched in silence, sensing something unspoken in the air, a story told not with words, but with motion. Halfway through, she noticed it, a subtle falter in his rhythm. His right hand trembled, barely perceptible, but real. He missed a step, recovered quickly and forced a smile. Clara's heart clenched. She thought it might be nerves, but the tremor persisted, small, insistent, uncontrollable. His gaze darted away, shame flickering across his face like shadow. She guided him gently, adjusting her movements to hide his imbalance. Their bodies found a quiet harmony, her strength shielding his weakness. The audience saw beauty. She saw truth. The man who had once mocked her for being small now fought desperately not to fall, and still he danced, proud, silent, pretending nothing was wrong. As the music deepened, so did her realization. His pride wasn't arrogance anymore, it was armor against fragility. The tremor spread to his shoulder, his jaw tightening as he tried to steady it. Clara's breath caught, tears pricked her eyes, though she never broke the rhythm. Every step became an act of mercy, every turn a promise not to expose him. He whispered, barely audible, "Don't stop." She nodded. "I won't." The words became their vow in motion. For the first time, they were equals, not through wealth or shame, but through shared humanity. The chandeliers above blurred as her eyes filled, the room glowing like memory. Their dance was no longer performance, it was confession. When the song neared its end, he faltered again, this time visibly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Clara tightened her grip, steadying him before anyone could see. She spun gracefully, drawing all eyes to her, buying him those precious seconds of dignity. He looked at her then, truly looked, and something in him broke open. Gratitude. Vulnerability. Awe. The final note trembled in the air like a held breath. They froze in position, her hand still over his. The applause erupted, loud, blinding, but he didn't move. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Clara smiled softly to the audience, then whispered through her tears, "It's all right." For a man who had once mocked weakness, that was the first time anyone had spoken to him without fear. As they stepped off the stage, he stopped her near the curtain. "You knew," he said, voice low, raw. "You saw it." She looked at him, her expression calm, almost tender. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "And you didn't let them see." Her answer came like a whisper wrapped in grace. "No one deserves to be humiliated twice." Alexander lowered his gaze, the weight of years collapsing in his chest. The applause faded into a dull hum behind them. "Thank you," he murmured, the words foreign to his tongue. Clara nodded once, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. "Now," she said softly, "the dance can truly begin." And for the first time, he understood that mercy was stronger than pride. The hall was empty now, the crowd dispersed, the chandeliers dimmed to amber silence. The echo of applause still lingered in the marble, fading like a ghost of sound. Alexander stood by the window, the city lights reflected across his pale face. His mask of charm and wealth had fallen away. What remained was a man hollowed by truth. Clara entered quietly, the train of her red dress brushing against the floor like a sigh. He didn't turn when he spoke. "It's been years since anyone saw me fall," he murmured. His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, pride, and something fragile. "I built an empire so no one would notice what I was losing." She stopped a few steps behind him, her heart tight. "And what was that?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Control, my body, my certainty." He turned then, and in the dim light she saw the tremor, no longer hidden, no longer denied. His hand shook as he lifted his glass, the water trembling before spilling over the rim. "Parkinson's," he said flatly. "Diagnosed 3 years ago." The word fell like broken glass between them. "You were right," he added bitterly. "Pride doesn't protect. It only isolates." Clara approached slowly, the sound of her heels soft, deliberate. "You've carried it alone," she said, "because that's what men like you are taught to do." He laughed once, a dry, hollow sound. "Men like me?" he echoed, arrogant, loud, terrified of being small. His eyes found hers again, and for the first time there was no arrogance left, only truth. "I remember that night," he continued. "The words I said, the way I laughed. I thought I was powerful, because I could make others feel less." His voice broke, trembling like the hand he could no longer control. "But when you looked at me tonight, you didn't see my failure, did you?" Clara shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I saw your humanity. Finally." He lowered his gaze, the shame pressing heavier than any diagnosis. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "You don't need to," she replied. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you allow." Her words sank deep, quiet and certain, like rain into dry earth. For a moment neither spoke. Only the city hummed beyond the glass, indifferent and eternal. "I spent my life building walls," he confessed, "and all it took was one dance to make them crumble." He laughed softly, almost to himself. "You should hate me." Clara stepped closer, her expression calm, luminous in the fading light. "I did," she said simply. "But hate is exhausting. I chose to outlive it." The honesty in her voice struck him harder than any insult. He sank into a chair, his posture heavy with surrender. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "That's good," she said gently. "It means you're ready to become someone better." She knelt beside him, placing her hand over his trembling one. For a moment the shaking slowed, not because of medicine, but because of peace. Tears welled in his eyes, a sight that would have humiliated him once. Now it felt almost holy. "You should have walked away," he whispered. "After what I did." Clara smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Maybe once I would have, but now I know walking away doesn't heal. Facing it does." Her voice carried the calm of someone who had already made peace with pain. They stayed there for a long time, two souls stripped of pride, wealth, and pretense. Outside, the night deepened, the rain beginning once more. In the reflection of the glass, they looked like a painting, not of lovers, but of redemption. And as the thunder murmured beyond the city, Alexander whispered, "Thank you for not letting me dance alone." A week later, the world buzzed with whispers of Alexander Voss, the billionaire who had disappeared from the spotlight. Rumors swirled of illness, confession, scandal. None of them were true, yet none were false. Behind the noise, he sat in silence, watching the city move like an orchestra without rhythm. Across town, Clara rehearsed in a quiet studio, unaware that fate was already preparing their final stage. It was Ramirez who brought the invitation, another charity gala, same venue, same glitter, same audience. But this time, the performance was hers to command. "He'll be there," Ramirez said softly. He asked for you. Clara froze, the paper trembling in her hands. Her instinct was to refuse, but something in her heart whispered otherwise. Redemption, after all, was not given. It was chosen. The night arrived heavy with anticipation. The ballroom glowed again in gold, but this time the light felt softer, less cruel. When Clara entered, heads turned not in mockery, but reverence. She wore white, not red, not fire, but forgiveness. Alexander stood near the stage, his cane steady, his eyes lowered. He looked smaller, older, infinitely more human. Their gazes met, and a hush swept the room. The orchestra waited for her signal. Clara took a breath, stepped forward, and extended her hand. "Shall we?" she asked. Alexander hesitated, eyes wet with disbelief, then nodded. When their hands met, a murmur rippled through the crowd, not of gossip, but of awe. It was the reunion no one expected, yet everyone needed. The first note played. The same tango that once marked humiliation now became hymn. Their movements began slowly, cautious, uncertain, yet full of grace. The audience leaned forward, witnessing not a performance, but a conversation of souls. Every step he took trembled, but Clara guided him, her strength invisible, her compassion radiant. Together, they turned pain into poetry. Halfway through, Alexander faltered. The tremor took him again, stronger this time. The music hesitated, then Clara lifted her hand, signaling the orchestra to continue. "Breathe," she whispered. He did. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat the crowd disappeared. She took his weakness and transformed it into rhythm, her movements wrapping his flaws in beauty. Applause began to rise before the music even ended. When the final chord sounded, they stood still, his chest heaving, her hands steady. The silence that followed was immense, sacred. Then the ballroom erupted in standing ovation. Tears blurred the golden lights, and even those who once laughed could no longer pretend they understood what strength looked like. Alexander bowed his head. "You carried me," he said quietly. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "No," she replied, "you learned to follow." The words were tender, teasing, true. For the first time in his life, Alexander Voss, the man who once ruled every room, let someone else lead, and it felt like freedom. Reporters would later write that the dance was more sermon than spectacle. They said no choreography could have captured such grace, such humility. But those who were there knew better. What they witnessed was forgiveness, not in words, but in motion. Two lives that began in pride now ended in harmony. As the applause faded into soft murmurs, Clara turned to him and whispered, "Now the story is complete." He nodded, tears glinting under the chandeliers. "Not complete," he said softly, "reborn." And as the lights dimmed around them, the gold of the ballroom no longer felt cruel. It felt like sunrise. The morning after the gala dawned quiet and clear. The city that once roared now seemed to hum softly, as if paying its respects to what had happened the night before. Newspapers filled their front pages with images of two dancers bathed in gold, one humbled, one reborn. The headlines spoke of beauty and scandal, but the truth was quieter than words. It lived in the silence that follows forgiveness. Alexander sat in his study, the newspaper untouched beside him. His reflection in the glass no longer frightened him. The tremor in his hand remained, but its meaning had changed. It no longer symbolized weakness, but proof that he was still alive. For years, he had chased power to hide from fragility. Now, fragility had become the source of his strength. When the phone rang, it wasn't a reporter or a shareholder. It was Clara. Her voice on the other end was calm, light, like wind brushing through sunlight. "I'm opening my own school," she said simply. "A place for those who've fallen and still wish to move." He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm in her words. "What will you call it?" he asked. She smiled. "La Escuela de la Esperanza, the School of Hope." A week later, he arrived at the opening, cane in hand, humility in his step. The studio smelled of wood polish and lilies, the air filled with soft laughter. Photographs lined the walls, dancers of every age and shape, their faces glowing with the kind of joy he had forgotten existed. Clara greeted him at the door, her white dress simple, her smile unguarded. "You came?" she said. "Of course," he replied. "You invited me to learn, didn't you?" He handed her an envelope. Inside was a check large enough to fund the school for years. "No strings," he said before she could protest. "Just gratitude." She looked up, eyes glistening. "You don't owe me anything," he shook his head gently. "I owe the world better than who I was." And in that moment, money, his old language of worth, finally found its purest translation. Later, as the students began their first lesson, Clara watched from the doorway. Their movements were clumsy, imperfect, full of laughter. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She turned to Alexander, who stood beside her, smiling faintly. "They remind me of us," she said. "Except," he added softly, "they started with kindness." The words made her laugh, light and true. As the sun streamed through the tall windows, dust danced in the light like tiny memories. Clara closed her eyes, feeling her mother's presence in the warmth around her. "She would have loved this," she whispered. "She already does," Alexander said quietly. There was no grandeur in his tone, no performance, just reverence for a love that never died. When the class ended, he approached the center of the floor. His steps were unsteady but determined. "One last dance?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. They moved slowly, gently. No audience, no applause, just two souls finding rhythm in forgiveness. Every tremor, every pause became part of the music. It wasn't perfection, it was peace. When the final note faded, they stood still, the afternoon light wrapping them in gold. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've changed," she said softly. "No," he replied, smiling faintly. "I've begun." It was the kind of truth that needed no witness, simple, human, eternal. Outside, the city moved on, cars, laughter, rain clouds gathering again. But in that small studio, time seemed to stop. A man had found humility, a woman had found healing, and together they had turned pain into beauty. And as Clara looked toward the window, where sunlight trembled like a heartbeat, she whispered, "The dance never really ends." Years passed, but the echoes of that final dance never faded. The world moved on, as it always does, yet in one small corner of the city, a school of dance became a sanctuary. Children came barefoot, widows came trembling, and dreamers came broken. Clara welcomed them all with the same quiet smile. To her, every soul who entered carried a rhythm waiting to be remembered. The studio walls were covered now, photographs, letters, drawings from students who found courage in movement. On one frame hung a faded picture of her mother, smiling beneath a sky of confetti. Below it, a small brass plate read, "For those who learn to dance again." When Clara passed it each morning, she touched the frame gently, as one greets a blessing. Alexander visited less frequently as time went on, but whenever he did, the air changed, slower, softer, reverent. His illness had progressed, but so had his peace. The tremor that once defined him now moved in rhythm with the music. "You see," he would whisper to the students, smiling faintly, "even when the body falters, grace remembers the way." Clara grew older, but time had touched her kindly. Her steps became smaller, but her presence larger, a quiet authority born not of fame, but of tenderness. When she spoke, students listened not because of what she said, but how she lived. Forgiveness had sculpted her into something unshakable, something luminous. One afternoon, a young girl approached her, nervous and teary-eyed. "Miss Clara," she asked, "how do you dance without fear?" Clara knelt, brushing the child's cheek with her hand. "You don't," she said softly. "You dance with it. That's how courage sounds when it moves." The girl smiled, and the lesson continued. A rhythm passed from heart to heart. As the sun set, the studio filled with warm light. Dust floated like gold, the air fragrant with roses from the window box. Music drifted faintly from the record player, the same tango that had once broken her. Now it sounded like prayer. She closed her eyes, swaying gently to the melody, her hand resting on her heart. She thought of Alexander then, of their last dance, their last words, the strange mercy that had bound them. Somewhere, she imagined, he was at peace, perhaps watching from a place where pride no longer mattered. "You taught me that even broken rhythm can still be beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. Outside, the city glimmered beneath the falling dusk. The laughter of her students spilled into the street, mingling with music and the sound of life. Clara stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The world no longer felt cruel. It felt alive, imperfect, unpredictable, but kind. She looked up at the fading sky and smiled. "The dance never ends," she murmured. "It only changes partners." Then she turned back to the studio, her steps slow but steady, the sound of her shoes marking time, not for applause, but for eternity. If this story moved you, if you felt the rhythm of forgiveness in your heart, subscribe to this channel to join us for more stories of kindness and redemption. And before you go, click on the video now appearing on your screen. Another story awaits you there, ready to remind you that hope always finds its way back to the dance.